Paris is one of the most famous cities in the world, a city that knows how to sell itself through images, stories, and carefully chosen symbols. In a city of lights and landmarks, of fashion, romance, and spectacle, and football eventually became part of that image. As the game modernized, money followed. With it came attention, cameras, and a global audience. The center of gravity shifted, slowly at first, then all at once. Paris didn't just change, it chose a different story. A louder story, a richer one, a version of football designed to be seen far beyond the city itself. Paris Saint-Germain became the club the world would recognize, but long before that chapter was written, another club already existed here. Not near monuments, not in neighborhoods shown on postcards, but in the north of the city, beyond the Périphérique, in Saint-Ouen. This is where Red Star was born. Founded in 1897, Red Star is older than Paris as a football capital, older than glamour, older than the idea that football should entertain first and belong second. For decades, this club was Parisian football, its working class heartbeat, its street level reality, a place where football reflected the lives of thousands of people watching it, and then the city moved, not physically, but culturally. The money flowed inward, attention followed success, the spotlight narrowed. Red Star didn't disappear overnight, it faded slowly, quietly, and almost politely. Not because it failed, but because it refused to transform itself into something unrecognizable. While Paris showed visibility, Red Star stayed rooted in its neighborhood, in its values, in a version of football that didn't translate well to the billboards. Today, Red Star is rarely mentioned when people talk about Parisian football, and yet on match days, in a stadium surrounded by tower blocks, markets, and everyday life, a different version of the city still gathers, not to escape reality, but to share it. Because this is not a story about trophies, or dominance, or success as modern football measures it. This is a story about a club that stayed where it was born, while the city around it kept moving. Welcome to Hidden Club Stories, where every club carries a story. This is a story of Red Star. This episode is sponsored by Hidden Shirt Club. They sell football shirt mystery boxes with the real stories. Long before football became a product, before clubs became brands and stadiums turned into destinations, Red Star already existed. Founded in 1897, at a time when football in France was still searching for this place, the club grew alongside the city itself. Paris was not yet the polished capital the world would later consume. It was raw, industrial, unequal. And Red Star belonged to that version of the city. The club settled in Saint-Ouen, a working class area shaped by factories, markets and migration. A place where football wasn't something you watched, it was something you shared. Red Star became a meeting point for workers finishing long shifts, for families building new lives on the edges of the capital, for people who didn't recognize themselves in the Paris of grand avenues and refined facades. Football here was never an escape, it was about recognition. In the early decades of the 20th century, Red Star began to collect trophies. Not with excess, but with consistency. They won fresh cups, they competed at the highest level, they became one of the most successful clubs of the era. But even then, success never changed the club's posture. Red Star didn't grow upward, it grew outward. Its identity became inseparable from its surroundings, from the streets that fed the stands, from the voices that filled the stadium. Politics found its way into the club's fabric. Saint-Ouen was a place of ideas, of resistance, and of collective thinking. Red Star never advertised itself as a political club, but it naturally attracted those who believed football could stand for something more than results. Anti-fascist banners appeared not as statements, but as extensions of everyday life. The stadium became a space where football and society overlapped, where chants echoed frustrations that existed far beyond the pitch, and for a long time this worked. Red Star didn't need to dominate Paris, it simply needed to represent a part of it that refused to be erased. But cities don't stay still. As Paris modernized, as money and media attention concentrated in the center, the margins were asked to adapt. Some clubs did, Red Star didn't. And that choice, quiet at first, almost invisible, would shape everything that followed. Cities rarely announce when they change. They don't stop, they don't pause, they don't look back. They simply move forward. And one day, you'll realize you're no longer at the center of the story. For Red Star, that moment didn't arrive with a single decision or a dramatic collapse. It came gradually, almost politely. Football in France began to modernize, television reshaped the game, sponsors entered the conversation, and stadiums became assets. Success was no longer only measured in trophies, but in visibility. Red Star remained what it had always been, in Saint-Ouen, in a stadium that felt lived in, not designed. Among supporters who cared less about trends than about belonging, but the game around them started asking different questions. How big is your audience? How marketable is your image? How easily can you be sold? Red Star had answers once, now these answers no longer fit. As Paris embraced a new football identity, one built for global consumption, attention drifted elsewhere. Paris Saint-Germain rose quickly, backed by resources Red Star never chased, playing a version of football made for screens and headlines. The contrast wasn't hostile, it was indifferent. Red Star didn't lose relevance because it failed on the pitch, it lost relevance because it refused to become part of a new ecosystem. Season by season, the gap widened. Budgets grew elsewhere, infrastructures improved elsewhere, ambitions began to sound like something that required permission. Red Star survived, but survival came at a cost. The relegations followed, promotions became rarer, stability disappeared. The club drifted between divisions, never fully collapsing, but also never fully returning. For many, Red Star became a name from the past, a footnote in Parisian football history, but in Saint-Ouen, nothing felt finished. The stadium still filled, not with numbers, but with intent. Supporters didn't come to witness success, they came to defend continuity. Banners spoke of memory, of resistance, of a club that still existed in its own terms. While football accelerated, Red Star slowed down, and in a world obsessed with progress, that made them easy to forget. But forgetting is not the same as disappearing. Red Star never announced that it was staying. There was no manifesto, no statement of intent, no moment where the club declared what it stood for. It simply didn't leave. While football chased scale, visibility and growth, Red Star remained rooted in Saint-Ouen, in a stadium that felt closer to a neighbourhood square than a modern arena. Here, football still smells like the street, of food stands opening before kickoff, of concrete warmed by the afternoon sun, of voices that recognize each other long before the team comes out. Supporters don't arrive early to be entertained, they arrive to take their place. Many of them didn't choose Red Star because of the trophies, they chose it because it felt familiar, because it reflected their lives, not an idealized version of the city. For some, Red Star was inherited, passed down like a habit or a language. For others, it was discovered later as a response to a football world that no longer felt human. The stands carry banners that don't need explanation, messages about a memory, about resistance, about refusing to be polished into something acceptable. Red Star doesn't try to compete with modern football, it coexists with it, carefully, critically. Promotion is welcomed, relegation is endured, but identity is never negotiated. And that quiet refusal, repeated season after season, is why this club never truly disappeared. Paris is often described as one city, and football It's not. It is 3 different IDs wearing 3 different shirts. Paris Saint-Germain represents the Paris the world sees, global, ambitious, designed for attention. It plays in a stadium that feels detached from daily life, built to host moments that travel far beyond the city itself. PSG doesn't speak to a neighbourhood, it speaks to an audience. Paris FC tells a different story. A club trying to rise quietly, positioned somewhere between ambition and anonymity. It wants to belong in the conversation without shouting. Paris FC represents possibility, what happens when a city grows too big to have only one voice. And then there's Red Star, not interested in scale, not interested in recognition, a club that never left its postcode, even when football left it behind. Where PSG is spectacle and Paris FC is aspiration, Red Star is presence. On the same weekend, 3 matches can be played in Paris. One will be watched by millions, one by thousands, one by few thousands who feel like they are defending something fragile. Not better, not purer, just different. And that difference explains everything, because Paris does not need one club, it needs contrast. For years, Red Star existed outside the conversation, not because it wasn't playing, but because it wasn't useful to the narrative modern football prefers to tell. It didn't offer glamour, it didn't promise exponential growth, it didn't fit neatly into highlight reels, and yet it endured. Through financial uncertainty, through stadium relocations, through seasons spent drifting between divisions. Red Star became something rare in modern football, a club whose greatest achievement was continuity, not survival at all costs, but survival without surrender. In the recent years, attention has slowly returned, not in waves, not with headlines, but with curiosity. A generation of supporters looking for something real, something grounded, something that still felt like football belonged to the people. Red Star didn't change to meet the demand, it simply waited, because it had always been there. Today, Red Star does not dominate headlines. It doesn't lead the conversation, it doesn't promise a future built on expansion or global reach. Instead, it exists. On match day, the stadium opens as it always has, not as an event but as a routine. People arrive on foot, from nearby streets, from familiar cafes. Some wear old scars, faded by the years of use, others arrive for the first time, curious rather than convinced. Red Star now moves between divisions, caught between the pool of professional football and the instinct to remain accessible. Their budget is modest, but the ambitious are cautious. Promotion matters, but not at the cost of becoming unrecognizable. The club continues to navigate a football world that keeps accelerating, while choosing deliberately to move on its own pace. Not slow, but grounded. There are seasons of hope and seasons of frustration. But unlike clubs chasing momentum, Red Star measures success differently. In presence, in the fact that Saint-Ouen still gathers, because Red Star's greatest achievement today is not where it plays, it is that it still plays where it belongs. Paris will always be many things at once. A global capital, a cultural symbol, a city that knows how to perform. But beyond the image, beyond the spotlight, and the spectacle, another Paris continues to exist. A Paris that doesn't sell itself, that doesn't shout, that doesn't ask to be recognized. Red Star belongs to that Paris. Not because it rejects the modern game, but because it remembers something the modern game often forgets. That football can be local, that it can belong, that it can stay. This club will not define Parisian football in numbers, it won't dominate headlines or shape algorithms, but as long as Saint-Ouen gathers on match days, as long as banners are raised without explanation, as long as voices recognize each other in the stands, Red Star will remain. Not as a memory, but as a presence. Because some stories don't need to be seen by the world to matter, they only need to be lived. Paris will always know how to sell itself, but in Saint-Ouen, football is still allowed to belong. Thank you for watching this episode of Hidden Club Stories. If you want to discover more clubs with identity, history and soul, make sure to subscribe, because somewhere out there another story is already waiting.